All right, so today we're diving into something pretty intense, survival trapping and hunting. Imagine you're out in the wilderness and you need to find food, like right now.
Yeah, it really makes you think outside the box, doesn't it? It's about skills and knowledge that, well, they seem kind of ancient these days.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to unpack today. We've got articles on bushcraft, hunting guides, even looked at a few websites selling survival gear. So we'll cover the practical techniques, but I think what's really interesting is the thinking behind successful trapping.
Yeah, the how is important, but the why is just as crucial, right? The strategy, the observation, turning basic materials into something that can actually help you survive.
Okay, so before we get into the specifics of traps, why is trapping so valuable when you're trying to survive? One article I read said it was like setting up multiple fishing lines. It lets you gather food passively while you do other things.
That's a great analogy. And it really gets at the whole energy efficiency thing, which is huge in survival. Every calorie counts, right? Hunting with a firearm, it can work, but it takes a lot of energy, a lot of focus, and a lot of time. Trapping, though, you set it up, and in a way, you kind of forget about it. For a while, at least.
Right. Makes total sense, especially when you're trying to build shelter, find water, all that other stuff. But I was reading about the noise factor. Some sources mention that as a downside of hunting with a firearm.
For sure. Depending on your situation, noise can be a bad thing. Could attract predators or even other people you might not want to run into. Traps, on the other hand, are silent, like setting up a bunch of invisible guards working for you 24/7.
Okay, now I really want to learn more about these invisible guards. Seems like snares are the most popular type, at least based on what I read.
Yeah, definitely. Snares are simple but very effective. Basically, it's a loop, they call it a noose, that tightens around the animal, usually the neck, when it's triggered.
You mentioned trigger mechanisms. How do those actually work?
Well, you've got two main types, passive and active. A passive snare depends on the animal's movement to tighten the noose. So think of a noose placed along a game trail. The animal walks through, its own weight activates the snare, and boom, the noose tightens.
So it's all about knowing where to put it and understanding how animals move. Makes sense. What about the active snares?
Active snares are a bit more complex. They use a spring to actively tighten the noose when it's triggered. Kind of like a mousetrap, but on a bigger scale. The twitch-up snare is a common example.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those. You need a specific kind of tree for a twitch-up snare, right?
Right. It has to be a sapling, a young tree that's bendy but still strong. You need it to provide the energy for the snare to work. They recommend using willow, birch, or maple.
Interesting. So it's not just any tree. It has to have the right characteristics for the trap. Is there a reason those trees in particular are best?
Definitely. It's all about their flexibility and how well they spring back. Willow, for example, is super pliable, and birch, it's got that springiness that's perfect for creating tension.
So even when you're surviving, you have to think like an engineer. You have to know your materials. It's amazing how much goes into something that seems as simple as a snare.
It really is. It shows how clever humans are, how we figure out how to adapt to tough situations. But then you have snares that are even simpler, like the simple wire snare.
I was reading about those. They sound almost too basic, just a wire loop. What makes them actually work?
Well, the simplicity is part of what makes them good, but it's really about placement and using the right kind of wire. Usually it's anchored to something solid, like a tree trunk, and placed along an animal trail. And using metal wire, not rope, is super important.
Because animals could chew through rope.
Exactly. Metal wire is more durable, it's not going to break as easily, and to make the loop itself, you create a loop at one end and thread the other end through it so it tightens when the animal pulls away.
I'm trying to picture this, and it seems like something you could learn to do, even if you've never done it before.
Oh, for sure. It's all about understanding the basics and practicing. Honestly, you can learn to make even the simplest traps pretty quickly if you have the right guidance and you put in the effort.
I might even try building one in my backyard just to see how it works, with all the safety precautions in place, of course.
I think that's a great idea. There's no better way to learn than by doing. But let's move on from snares for a bit and talk about another kind of trap, deadfall traps.
Deadfall traps, those are for bigger animals, right? I remember reading about them. They sounded more complicated than snares.
They are a bit more involved, but they work on the same basic idea, using the animal's movement to set off the trap. But instead of a noose, it uses a heavy object, something like a log or a rock, to, fall on the animal.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Using gravity and leverage. Are there different types of deadfall traps, just like there are different snares?
Yeah, there are a bunch of variations, but one of the most common and one that works really well is the figure 4 deadfall.
figure four. Why is it called that?
Because of the way it's built. You use 3 sticks, and you carve and arrange them so they look like the number 4. That's what holds up the heavy object until the trap's triggered.
I can see why it's so classic. Simple concept. But you need to understand how it works, the balance and all. What kind of wood do you usually use for the figure four?
It really depends on what's around and the environment. But you want strong, straight branches that can handle the weight. Hardwoods like oak or hickory.
So choosing the right wood matters here too, just like with the twitch-up snare. It's all connected.
Absolutely. And you have to think about the weight and size of what's going to fall. It needs to be heavy enough to, do the job quickly, but not so heavy that you can't even set it up.
Sounds like a tricky balance. I can see why experience and practice are so important.
Exactly. Now, the figure four is really popular, but there are simply ones too, like the Paiute deadfall.
Paiute deadfall. What's that one like?
It's known for being easy to build, which is great if you need to set up a bunch of traps quickly. It uses a similar trigger to the figure four, but it's put together a little differently. Often they use a forked branch to hold up the weight.
So if you were new to deadfall traps, that might be a good one to start with, like a stepping stone.
Exactly. It teaches you the basics without having to do a lot of intricate carving or measuring. But no matter what kind of deadfall you choose, the same basic principles apply. You have to understand the animals, pick the right spot, and make sure it's going to work quickly and humanely.
It's incredible these techniques seem so primitive, but they require a lot of knowledge about nature and mechanics.
It really shows how adaptable and smart our ancestors were, and it makes you realize how relevant these skills still are even today.
So we've talked about snares, deadfalls, the importance of watching your surroundings and choosing the right wood. But I think it's time to address the elephant in the room.
You mean the legal and ethical stuff, even when it's about survival?
Yeah, exactly. I was reading that it's important to know the trapping laws where you are, even if you're in a life or death situation.
Definitely. And there are good reasons for those laws. They're often there to protect animals, prevent overtrapping, and make sure things are done humanely.
So it's not just about grabbing whatever you can to survive. It's also about the impact you have on the environment, right?
Right. And in a way, knowing the rules can actually help you be more successful.
How so?
Well, if you know what you're allowed to trap, the methods you can use, and when you're allowed to do it, you can focus your efforts on what's most likely to work and do it in a way that minimizes harm.
Like having a guidebook leading you to the best and most ethical way to do it. Makes sense. But what about how it feels to do this? Some of the sources I read talked about how taking a life, even for survival, can be a really tough decision.
That's something people don't talk about enough, but it's really important. Imagine yourself in that situation, having to kill an animal to stay alive. That's not something you take lightly.
I can imagine it would weigh on you, even if you knew it was necessary.
For sure. A lot of the sources emphasize treating the animal with respect, making sure it doesn't suffer, and using every part of it you can to honor what it gave you.
So it's not just seeing it as food. It's about acknowledging that you took a life to keep yourself alive. That's a powerful way to look at it.
It is, and it really shows that survival trapping goes beyond just building traps. It's about connecting with nature in a deeper way, understanding the balance of life and death, and respecting how everything is connected.
Wow. That's a lot to think about. I'm starting to realize that trapping is way more complex than I thought. It's not just the how, it's the why, the who, and the impact.
That's exactly it. And I think we've covered a good foundation of the basics of survival trapping, but there's still more to explore, especially when it comes to actually using these techniques.
I'm definitely ready to go deeper, and I think our listeners are too. We'll be back soon to keep exploring survival trapping and hunting, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive on survival trapping and hunting. As we keep talking about this, it's becoming pretty clear that to be really good at this, one skill is super important.
You're talking about observation, right? Like being able to really see what's going on in nature, how animals act.
Exactly. It's like being a detective, You're looking for clues to figure out where animals are going, what they're eating, all that stuff.
So it's not just about setting traps anywhere. It's about putting them in the right spot based on what you see in the wild.
That's it. One source I read, they said it's like thinking like the prey. You have to put yourself in the animal's shoes to figure out where it's going to go and what it's going to do.
That's a really cool way to think about it.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of how, watching animals could tell you where to put a trap?
Sure. Let's say you're in a place with lots of rabbits, and you see trails leading to a patch of clover, and you see their droppings there. They're coming to that spot to eat.
Okay, so you put your trap near the clover, along one of those trails.
Exactly. You're using what you know about the rabbit, what it likes to eat, to increase your chances of catching it. It's about working with nature, not against it.
This reminds me of what we said earlier about choosing the right bait. If you want to catch rabbits, using something like carrots or apples makes sense, right? Stuff they actually eat.
Absolutely. The bait has to be something the animal wants. And like we talked about, it shouldn't be something that's everywhere in that area. Otherwise, the animal might not even notice your trap.
So you're creating a menu, offering something special that's different from what's already there.
Yeah.
It's like a special treat.
That's a perfect way to put it. And just like a chef thinks about how to present the food, you need to think about how you present the bait in the trap. Sometimes, with things like snares, it's good to put the bait, or even just a similar smell, right on the trigger.
So you're making sure that when the animal tries to get the bait, it sets off the trap.
You got it. It's about making the most of your effort and making sure the trap works when it's supposed to.
Okay, I'm really starting to see the strategy involved. It's like a game, you have to think ahead.
It is. It's a lot like that. Speaking of thinking ahead, let's get back to the idea of leave no trace. It's really important for anything you do outdoors, but especially for trapping.
We talked about it a little bit before, but I'd love to hear more about what it means for trapping.
Basically, leave no trace means you try to have as little impact on the environment as possible, even when you're trying to survive. It's about respecting nature and making sure it's healthy for the future.
So it's not just taking what you need, it's about doing it in a way that doesn't hurt things.
Right, right. When you're trapping, this might mean choosing trap locations so you don't mess up delicate habitats, using materials that break down naturally, and cleaning up any mess you make.
So, like, if you use wire snares, you wouldn't just leave them there in the woods when you're done.
Ideally not. If you can, you should take them down so they don't hurt other animals or the environment. And if you're using natural stuff like branches and sticks, you would spread them out so they decompose naturally.
That brings up an interesting point. What if you absolutely need to trap food, but you're worried about harming the environment? How do you decide what to do?
That's a tough one, and there's no easy answer. But one thing you could do is use traps that let you release animals you don't want to catch.
So something like a cage trap where you can check it often and let go any animals that aren't good to eat or are protected.
Exactly. Those kinds of traps give you more control, so you're less likely to accidentally catch or hurt an animal you didn't mean to.
It's good to remember that even when you're trying to survive, you still have to be responsible and try not to damage the environment.
I agree. And speaking of responsibility, there's another side to ethical trapping that can be really tough to deal with, the emotional side.
You mean how it feels to actually kill an animal, even if you need to for survival?
Yes. That's not something you see in a lot of survival guides, but it's something everyone who thinks about trapping should know about. Taking a life, no matter what the reason, can be hard, especially for people who haven't done it before.
I can imagine it would be especially hard for people who really care about animals and nature.
It definitely can be.
Yeah.
There's no easy way to deal with those feelings. But just recognizing them, getting support if you need it, and remembering that you're doing it to survive can help.
So it's about understanding the seriousness of taking a life, respecting the animal, and using the experience to learn and grow.
That's it. Now, let's change gears a bit and talk about something else that's really important, personal safety.
I think it's easy to get excited about learning these techniques, but you have to remember that the wilderness can be dangerous.
You're absolutely right. Safety always comes first. It means being aware of your surroundings, knowing the dangers, and doing what you need to protect yourself from both animals and other people.
So what kind of precautions are we talking about specifically?
Well, the most basic thing is to always tell someone where you're going and when you'll be back. That way, if something happens, someone knows where to look for you.
That's like Wilderness Safety 101. But it's easy to forget when you're focused on other things.
It is. It's also super important to know about the animals that live in the area you're going to, how they act, and how to avoid them or stay safe if you run into them.
So you have to do your research before you go.
Yeah.
What about gear? Are there any specific things that are important for safety when you're trapping or hunting?
A good first aid kit is a must-have. And depending on where you are, you might want to have bear spray, a personal alarm, or something to signal for help, like a whistle or a mirror. Those can be lifesavers if things go wrong.
What about the traps themselves? Any safety tips for setting them up or checking them?
Definitely. You have to handle traps carefully because you could hurt yourself or someone else. Always wear gloves, especially with traps that have sharp parts, and be mindful of where you put them so they don't go off accidentally.
So you wouldn't set a trap near a trail where someone could walk into it by accident.
Exactly. And when you're checking traps, Be careful. Assume they're ready to go off. Don't reach into them or try to take them apart without making sure they're safe first.
It seems obvious, but I guess it's easy to get careless, especially when you're tired or stressed.
We all do it, but in the wilderness, even small mistakes can have big consequences.
So staying alert, thinking ahead, and respecting both the power of nature and how dangerous traps can be are crucial for staying safe and successful.
You nailed it. With that in mind, I think we've covered the main safety points for survival, trapping, and hunting. But there's one more thing we need to talk about. What you do with the animal after you've caught it.
That's something I'm curious about, but also a little nervous about. I've read a little bit about field dressing, and it seems like it takes a lot of skill and, well, a strong stomach.
It's not for everyone, that's for sure. But when you're trying to survive, knowing how to properly prepare an animal can make all the difference.
So it's not just about catching it, it's about using everything you can to stay alive.
Exactly. One of the sources I read said it perfectly. Every part of the animal has a purpose. Nothing goes to waste.
Welcome back for the last part of our deep dive on survival trapping and hunting. We've covered a lot, like how to actually build traps, the ethical side of it, how important it is to observe your surroundings, and staying safe. But there's one big thing we haven't talked much about yet.
You mean what happens after you catch something? How to actually process the animal, which is a skill people don't always think about, but it's really important.
Exactly. I got to be honest, this part kind of makes me squeamish. But when you're in a survival situation, you need to know how to, field dress an animal and use every part of it, right?
It's about making the most of what you have and respecting the animal.
Yeah.
You're taking what you need to survive, but you do it in a way that honors the animal. One source I read said it really well. Every part of the animal has a purpose. Nothing goes to waste.
That's a really powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. Where do you even start with field dressing an animal?
First, you got to make absolutely sure the animal is dead. Then you need to find a good spot to do it. Somewhere clean and flat, away from your camp and any water.
That makes sense. You don't want to attract other animals or get your water dirty. Okay, that's next.
Next, you got to skin the animal, which means taking the hide off carefully. You can use a sharp knife or even a sharpened rock if that's all you got.
I've seen videos where hunters use super sharp knives for this. It seems like you need to be really precise.
Yeah, you want to make clean cuts so you don't ruin the meat. And if you're going to use the hide for something like clothes or shelter, you want to keep it in good shape.
So you skin it and then you gut it, right?
Right. Gutting is taking out all the organs inside. This part's tricky because you don't want to poke a hole in the intestines or the bladder. You could contaminate the meat.
I can see why it would be good to know some basic anatomy, like where to cut and what to avoid.
Totally. Once you take the organs out, you got to check the meat really carefully for any signs of disease or parasites.
Oh, so you're making sure it's safe to eat? That's something I didn't even think about.
It's super important. You don't want to get sick, especially when you're trying to survive. Your health is everything.
So let's say you've done all that. You field dressed the animal. Now what do you do with the meat?
Well, it depends on what you have and what the environment's like. If you can cook it, you can do that right away. But if not, you got to preserve it somehow so it doesn't go bad.
I've heard of smoking and drying meat to preserve it. Can you do that in a survival situation?
Yeah, sometimes you can. Smoking needs a source of smoke and something to contain it. And drying needs good airflow and not too much humidity. Both take time and planning, but they can make your meat last a lot longer.
So you got to be flexible and use what you have around you.
Exactly. And remember, all the other parts of the animal, those are valuable too.
Right, like the hide for clothes or shelter. What about stuff like bones and tendons?
You can sharpen bones to make tools or weapons. Tendons can be used for sewing or tying things together. Even the organs inside can be useful. Like you can use the bladder to carry water or small things.
Wow, it's like everything has a use. It's pretty amazing.
It really is. It shows how connected our ancestors were to nature. They knew how to use every single part of an animal.
It's a good reminder that we've kind of lost touch with that way of life.
Yeah, we have. But even if we don't need to use these skills to survive, learning them can teach us to be more resourceful and to respect nature.
You know, through all these conversations about trapping and hunting, I've realized it's about so much more than just getting food. It's about problem solving, being able to adapt, being tough, and really understanding nature.
It's a journey of learning to depend on yourself and discovering new things. It pushes you physically, mentally, and emotionally, and it makes you really think about your values and what you believe in.
It shows us that we're capable of a lot more than we think.
Exactly. And that deep down, we all have what it takes to survive. even when things get really tough.
Well said. I think that wraps up our deep dive into survival, trapping, and hunting. But this is just the start. I hope this inspires you to keep exploring.
If there's one thing I hope you take away from this, it's how important it is to be prepared, to learn, and to respect nature.
And remember, even if you never actually need to use these skills in a real survival situation, what you've learned can make your life better in so many ways.
So be curious, keep learning, and as always, happy exploring.